Just because a movie makes $1 billion at the box office doesn't mean it's good. In this series, I'll be doing a deep dive into one of the most frustrating screenplays I've ever read. The hugely successful, Oscar-nominated Joker. If you break Joker down to its essential beats, you can practically see the index cards on the bulletin board. It looks like structure. Things escalate, the movie gets darker, the situations get more extreme, but this is really just the illusion of structure, because each beat, whether it's the status quo or the inciting incident or the Act 1 turn, fail to do what the beat is designed to do. So what we're left with is a bunch of atmosphere and disconnected events. But before we jump into the beats, there's an even bigger fundamental problem with Joker. The essential engine of the story is broken. Joker never establishes a yes or no thematic question for the characters to test. Sure, there are thematic statements like society creates monsters, or anyone can be the villain if they have a bad enough day, or eat the rich. But none of that helps actually guide the story. Here's what I think the cleanest version of a thematic question is for Joker. Do people get what they deserve? With that as the engine, every character now has something specific to play off of, which creates clear worldviews, strategies, behaviors, flaws, and arcs. It also creates opposing worldviews so that the characters can apply constant pressure on Arthur to make the choices that he ultimately makes. Unfortunately, Joker never creates this system. This will become more and more clear with each beat that we deconstruct. So let's start at the beginning. The opening image. The opening image of the screenplay is Arthur painfully laughing uncontrollably at the social worker's office before asking, is it just me or is it getting crazier out there? This scene was moved in the final cut of the film to be after Arthur is attacked by the kids in the alley, which explains why that seemingly transformative event is never even mentioned here. In the film, we open with Arthur in front of the mirror, stretching the corners of his mouth to create this unnatural smile as he cries, eventually letting his face go lax, clearly emotionally detached. Honestly, both of these openings work really well. They set the mood, they draw us in, they create mystery and empathy, and they both bookend the story nicely with the final image of a fully formed Joker no longer in pain. So far, so good, right? So what happens next? The status quo. It's a lot of atmosphere, but structurally, none of it drives Arthur's behavior or applies pressure to the plot in a way that makes the inciting incident feel inevitable. Let's walk through it scene by scene. Getting attacked. Todd Phillips and Scott Silver, who I'll just refer to as the writers from here on out, they think they're being clever by having Arthur get hit by the everything must go sign, as if the story were so subtle that we needed these types of Easter eggs. Remember, we're talking about a world literally covered in garbage. All right, so subtlety was never on the menu for Joker. Anyway, Arthur doesn't really interact with these kids at all. They don't seem to represent any sort of purpose other than to punish Arthur, kind of like generic bullies in a movie about high school. And then we cut to the title card, Joker. I guess this is the writer's way of having a teaser introduce us to the world of Gotham. In the screenplay, the social worker scene and the attack take up about 6¼ pages. And it's done nothing to push the plot towards the inciting incident or hint at the engine of the story. Using my theme question of, do people get what they deserve? The scene could have stated that theme, which is something Blake Snyder says is essential to screenplay architecture in Save the Cat. One of the kids could have easily said to Arthur as he's kicking him, "You nobody, you clown, you're nothing, and you got what you deserved." But this didn't happen, so pressing on. Now I'll discuss the social worker scene, since this is where it takes place in the film. The social worker doesn't present an opposing worldview for Arthur to push against. She doesn't even comment on his laugh and his condition. She exists only as an exposition machine so that the audience can learn about Arthur's mental health issues, introduce his joke book, and his connection to his mother. And it's the joke book / journal that stood out for me most in this scene. Obviously, this is the writer's attempt to give us Travis Bickle's journal in Taxi Driver. And it's meant to track Arthur's distorted view of himself and the world. But it doesn't. The only passage that we get from the journal is, I just hope my death makes more sense than my life. Compare that to the first entry of Travis's journal that we hear in Taxi Driver, which ends with, someday a real rain will come and wash all this scum off the streets. Travis's journal gives us the inside scoop on Travis's psychosis, and it presents us with an unreliable narrator, which is a crucial element in analyzing the film as a whole. We get his disgust for the city, we get his growing racism and disdain, his attempt to keep himself busy and use routine, and how restless he is, and most importantly, it sets up Travis as the rain that will wash the scum off the streets. In Joker, all we get is a pun. I'd say the scrapbook style mania and pornography, which is also a not so subtle nod to Taxi Driver, run closer to the notebooks in Seven, but even those give us an insight into John Doe's motivation and worldview. The passage that Somerset reads from the journal, and forgive my terrible Morgan Freeman impression, ends with, I threw up all over him, and I couldn't stop myself from laughing. It really is a terrible Morgan Freeman. That tells us a lot about who John Doe is and why he's doing what he's doing. What does the joke in Arthur's journal tell us about Arthur? That he's sad? He's suicidal? Is this one of his jokes or just a random entry into his journal? Who knows? On to the bus. In the script, this happens right after the title card on page 7, presumably the same day as the attacks in the alley, although we never know it from how unaffected and unbruised Arthur appears. Same patterns emerge here. The mother who chastises Arthur doesn't present any sort of opposing worldview. She's just another example of how cruel the world is, which we already know from the beatdown in the alley and the social worker scene and the overall atmosphere in Gotham. So this is the writer's attempt at a save the cat moment. We're supposed to see this as Arthur trying to bring the world joy through laughter, but really, this is just another setup for exposition, namely his medical card. I guess they thought that it was necessary to explain his laughter, even though the film would have functioned just fine without it. I mean, I don't really think anybody watching the movie would think that Arthur was laughing voluntarily. Then it's on to Arthur's depressing shuffle back home and up the stairs. Credit where credit is due. Introducing this demoralizing walk up the stairs is great visual storytelling when compared to the dancing sequence on the stairs later on. It's very similar to the juxtaposition of Miles Morales' fall and rise in Into the Spider-Verse. But once again, nothing of substance happens in this sequence. We see more garbage, Arthur's made fun of by more kids, and then he gets in the elevator and goes up to see his mom. This is on page 8 of the script, and it's interesting to note that in an April 2018 draft of the script, which was considerably longer at 120 pages, this is where Sophie was introduced. From a screenplay architecture perspective, introducing Sophie here is a much stronger choice, as it falls right into the seed section of the status quo. And that's where something happens that hints at the disruption of the ordinary world, but doesn't actually disrupt it yet. By delaying Sophie's introduction, the final script and film squandered the impact of the B story, choosing instead to wrap the Sophie fantasy into the Murray fantasy. My humble opinion, that was a pretty big unforced error. Anyway, back to the story. We're at home with Arthur and we meet his mother, Penny. She doesn't challenge Arthur at all. I guess she's supportive of him, loving, but as a character, she doesn't really do anything other than introduce the Thomas Wayne thread and act as a transition to watching Maury on TV. This would have been a good place to have some conflict, but there is none. All we get is Arthur saying to his mom, maybe you shouldn't watch so much TV. That takes us to page 11, which is Murray's show and Arthur's first fantasy, which can only be described as a copy of The King of Comedy. And if you haven't seen The King of Comedy, pause this video, go watch The King of Comedy, and then come back. All we get from this fantasy sequence is that Murray's clearly important to the story. He's someone that Arthur admires. But why? There's lots of comedians in the world, and Arthur claims that he's passionate about comedy, so why latch on to Murray? And what do we even know about Murray here. What's Murray's worldview? How'd he get famous? Is he known for being a bully or a hard worker? All of these unanswered questions are symptomatic of the broken story engine that we talked about earlier. Because he's not a defined perspective, he's merely an image that reinforces Arthur's desire to have a father figure. This is a sloppy mirror to the Thomas Wayne bit that was set up in the scene right before this. And even in his fantasy, we learn nothing about Arthur. This is his fantasy where nobody's listening, nobody's watching. He could literally say anything. He can do anything. It's a fantasy. So why not say something interesting? Like sometimes I feel so angry. Sometimes I just feel like letting it all out, And one day a real rain is going to come and wash the scum off the streets of Gotham. And then who knows? Maybe Murray reinforces his psychosis and says, you know what? That's a great idea. All that scum out there, all those motherfuckers, they're going to get what they deserve. It's my bad De Niro. But you see what I did there, though? I took it back to the theme question of, do people get what they deserve? But instead, all we get is, my mother told me that I had a purpose, to bring laughter and joy to the world. This scene bothers me for so many reasons, but primarily because it could have laid the groundwork for a lot of events that later feel random and born out of necessity, namely when Murray humiliates Arthur later in the movie. What if, instead of or before the fantasy sequence, we actually watch Murray conduct an interview or do a bit? Show us that Murray's answer to, do people get what they deserve, is yes. And if you work hard enough, if you're good enough, you deserve success. And if you're not, you deserve ridicule. This would have put him at odds with Arthur, who thinks that he deserves more than what the world is giving him simply because he exists. It could have also set Murray up as some sort of insult comic, doing bits about other comedians or making fun of other people's misfortunes. And how about this? What if after Murray roasts some poor fool wannabe comic, he turns to the audience and says, ladies and gentlemen, if you think you have what it takes to go toe-to-toe with Murray, come to the Gotham Comedy Club tonight or Thursday night at 11 o'clock p.m. for an open mic, and the winner gets to come on my show and do a set and be interviewed by yours truly. This would have given Arthur a mission heading into Act 2. Point is, this was a missed opportunity to set up the direction of the narrative and the ending of the film, all right there on pages 11 to 14. Now, this is a scene that did not exist in the April 2018 draft at all. In that draft, we get the opening of the show, and then we cut to Arthur trying to deliver his mother's letter to Thomas Wayne at his office. Which is better? Honestly, neither of them. Sorry, but they're both missed opportunities. Sticking with the final shooting script, though, this takes us to page 14 of the screenplay, which traditional screenplay architecture tells us should be the beginning of the inciting incident sequence. For the film, we're just about over 15 minutes, so pretty much a one-to-one relationship between the script and the film. And here is where Joker really begins to fall apart at the seams. Page 14 of the script, which is about minute 15 into the movie, is the perfect place to put your inciting incident. That gives you a decent chunk of time to establish your story engine without rushing through anything, and it's early enough in the story to keep things moving at a good clip. Here's how the dominoes are supposed to fall. The inciting incident is the first major domino. It introduces a problem into the protagonist's life, but it does not force them to try and solve it. Instead, it slowly backs them into a corner until they're forced to make a choice. So how does Joker stack up? Poorly. Let's start with the inciting incident. The beat sheet would imply that Randall giving Arthur the gun on page 14 is the inciting incident. But is it? Does this disrupt the status quo? Does it present a problem that needs to be solved? Does it challenge Arthur's worldview or push him towards the Act 1 turn? To know the answer, you have to know where you're headed. You have to dial into what the Act 1 turn is. So to make things easier, I'll go ahead and I'll just say flat out that the subway killings is the Act 1 turn in Joker. And as I'll explain a little later on, it doesn't do the job that the Act 1 turn is supposed to do, but it's clear that this is what the writers thought was the big event, the big moment that moved us from Act 1 into Act 2. How does Randall giving Arthur the gun start the cause and effect momentum that will inevitably lead to the subway killings. And don't tell me that, he gave him the gun that he ends up using, and he says he's got to defend himself, or that this turns Arthur's internal battle into some sort of external battle. That's all nonsense. The truth is, getting Arthur the gun was nothing more than a narrative requirement. Arthur needs the gun in order to be able to kill those pricks on the subway. That's it. Now, I haven't checked the credits of the movie to see what Randall's last name is, but it might as well be Chekhov, because this is just Chekhov's gun. You introduce it, you got to use it later on. What if, after being beaten up, Arthur's social worker dismisses his pain, and he's openly mocked by the mother on the bus? And then he fights with his mother, with Penny, because he thinks that she's blind to how horrible the world is. Then maybe Arthur approaches Randall for the gun. Now, now we have movement. Now we have a chain of events that build on each other. And now we have a man who feels powerless and unseen, and who feels like he's tired of the world walking all over him. And now he has a gun. One more side note about Randall, because this really bothers me. Randall is an egregious example of creating a character just to be used as a tool instead of as an opposing worldview. Randall has no consistency or purpose other than to give the plot what it needs when it needs it. Arthur needs a gun, Randall gives him a gun. Arthur needs to be betrayed, Randall betrays him. Arthur needs to do something brutal and horrifying before he shows up on Murray. Randall shows up as his friend to see how he's doing because his mom's in the hospital. All of a sudden, Randall's his friend again, and he's just there so that Joker can kill him. So what happens now? Presumably, we're in the chaos section of the film, which is the part of the movie that bridges the inciting incident and the Act 1 turn. So let's see what happens. Arthur's yelled at by his boss and says he'll have to pay for the sign that got busted. Then Joker stomps on some garbage bags, and he makes his sad commute home, and then he holds the elevator door open for Sophie. And she immediately challenges Arthur's worldview by saying, "Oh, this building's just so awful, isn't it?" Oh, no, wait, that doesn't challenge anything. That just reinforces what Arthur already believes. And remember, we won't know that their future relationship is a figment of Arthur's imagination until much later in the story. So her character has got to work and function like a real person now. So what's the point of introducing Sophie as an object of desire? Is this some sort of deep cut reference to John Hinckley Jr.'s imaginary girlfriend, Lynn Collins, which would be another connection to Taxi Driver? Why does Arthur latch on to her now? Did she just move in? In the April 2018 draft, it's clear that Sophie knows Arthur and knows his mother, but that was all taken out of the final cut. Up until this scene, you'd expect Arthur to have avoided eye contact with Sophie, or maybe just focus on her daughter like he did when he focused on the little boy on the bus. But again, we're really not dealing with consistency here. We're just watching things happen to Arthur. and the dude's got a gun in his pocket. So, maybe fingering that deadly metal penis in his pocket makes him feel more confident. Maybe that's why he engages and says hello. Maybe Sophie has something more interesting to say. Or maybe I should just go rewatch Taxi Driver. Meeting Sophie is a much better inciting incident than getting the gun, if it was set up better. If she represents something good and pure in this shithole of a city, and Arthur is presented with a way to protect or save her, or at the very least, to get her to see him, then that would satisfy the story engine and the main job of the inciting incident. Back to Joker. Arthur holds the elevator, has his worldview reinforced, he pretends to shoot himself in the head, and then he gives his mother a bath. Nothing new here, just more Thomas Wayne setup, and a slight insult from Penny where she says, "Don't you have to be funny to be a comedian?" I actually like this line. It's so damaging in such an innocent way. Nice job with that, writers of Joker. So then what happens? He dances around with the gun in the living room, and it's a setup for the bathroom dance later on, and he accidentally shoots the gun. So what are we supposed to learn about Arthur? That he loves his rib cage? I guess. We get a small bit about how Arthur's suicidal, even though it's not connected with the cruelty of the world. It's just a one-off kind of line about how Randall shouldn't have given him a loaded gun. And then what does he do? He stalks Sophie, because why not? Why wouldn't he? Does she do anything interesting while he's stalking her? Anything that reinforces the movie's themes or pushes us towards the subway murders? No. So after creeping on Sophie and finding out where she works, Arthur hits up the comedy club for the first time. This is on page 23, okay? We're 23 pages in, and even though we've had a line here and there about how committed Arthur is to comedy, this is actually the first time that we see him pursuing anything or even going to the comedy club. And here's where we get a huge missed opportunity. The open mic flyer that he takes from the club. Had this been set up by Murray on his show and framed as an open mic competition where the winner gets to perform on Murray and be interviewed by him, then this would have made a lot of sense. But as it is, it's just a necessary plot point to get Arthur on stage so that he could be humiliated by Murray later on. Anyway, back to Mom's, where Sophie shows up and totally calls him out for being a creeper and following her around. Obviously, I'm just kidding. She's not weirded out by this at all. In fact, she said that she wished he had come in and robbed the place. Oh, and then she says how funny he is. I don't understand this part at all. I don't understand why the writers decided to hand Sophie over to Arthur without him even earning her affection at all. I don't understand what purpose she serves other than to reinforce his fantasy life of her as his girl and Murray as his father. I don't understand why the sequence is here when we have real ground to cover before we get to the subway killings within the next few pages. I'm just honestly baffled. So let's keep going. On page 25 of the script is where Arthur stretches his face into the smile. This is what was moved into the opening image of the film. And from there, we're at the children's hospital where he drops his gun and ends up getting fired on page 27. Okay. So this actually feels like an inciting incident. I mean, at least it feels a lot more like an inciting incident than Randall giving him the gun. But what are the stakes here? What does getting fired represent to Arthur? We know that he's having money problems, but that's really kind of what I would call the side pickle of the story. Gotham's lack of humanity is the sandwich, right? But his money problem is really just kind of like the side pickle that comes with the sandwich. It's not really what we're too concerned about here. You get it? I hope you get it. Okay, great. The problem with this being the inciting incident is that there's no breathing room between this event and the Act 1 turn, which is the subway killings. There's really nothing for Arthur to debate or question or consider. He's fired, he's on the subway, he kills some assholes. So let's pause here to see if there's something in the April 2018 version that adds anything to this sequence of events. In that version, we get a scene of Arthur interacting with Sophie at the bank that she works at. Unfortunately, nothing interesting happens. So it's not a huge loss that it was cut from the film. My guess is that the writers thought that this would be kind of confusing once we found out that their relationship was a fantasy, so they just cut it. Honestly, that's fine. It doesn't really do anything other than to push the subway scene to page 31. Here we have arrived at the Act 1 term. Just like with all the other beats in this film, the subway killings is just an event. It's just a thing that happens. Now, Arthur does choose to kill the third guy in cold blood. He chases him down and shoots him. This is an active choice because he could have just run away. That's a good moment. But where does it lead? The bathroom. Now, I really do like this scene. I like the scene where he starts dancing in the bathroom. It actually feels cathartic. When I first read it and when I first heard about it, I thought, oh my God, this is going to be so forced and insufferable and awful. And yet it worked. I mean, it really worked for me, I think largely in part of Joaquin Phoenix's performance. Unfortunately, it didn't advance the story in any meaningful way whatsoever. In a better structured script, Arthur would have taken this newfound confidence, born out of the blood of strangers, and doubled down on it. Not by punching the time clock when he leaves his job or by rushing into Sophie's apartment and kissing her, but by seeking out more violence. This is something that American Psycho gets right, that Fight Club gets right, that Taxi Driver gets right. And now take a step back here to hypothesize how the subway killings could have worked. What if these shitheads had been introduced earlier and Arthur chose not to interact with them? What if this time felt different because of the growing relationship he has with Sophie, or because after he was fired, he went to the comedy club for comfort, but these assholes were heckling the guy on stage? Because you see where I'm going here, right? Joker is so frustrating because it had all of the ingredients to make a compelling film. Unfortunately, the writers decided to use salt instead of sugar. The deeper that I analyzed the screenplay, the harder it became to actually identify a stable midpoint, a structural movement. Joker keeps opening narrative threads that seem like they might become the central engine of the story before dissolving into another explanation for Arthur's transformation. So rather than forcing an artificial midpoint structure into the movie, I want to look at each major thread and ask the following questions. What do the writers seem to think that this thread is accomplishing? Why doesn't it fully work structurally? And what do the changes between the drafts reveal about the problem? Let's start with Sophie. Sophie is clearly intended to represent Arthur's final emotional connection to ordinary human life. She symbolizes intimacy, companionship, and the possibility that some part of Arthur is still capable of normal emotional attachment. That's why the reveal works in theory. When Arthur enters Sophie's apartment later in the movie and we realize that their relationship never existed, the screenplay wants that moment to feel like the final psychic collapse. Arthur has now completely lost touch with reality. His last tether to humanity is gone. But structurally, Sophie barely functions as an active force before the reveal. After the subway killings, Arthur, he's got this confidence and he goes to her apartment and he kisses her. And then she pretty much just completely disappears from the movie. She sits there watching him at the comedy club. She's sitting next to him at the hospital after Penny collapses. But that's about it. She never interacts with Arthur in any sort of meaningful way after the kiss. She doesn't challenge him. She doesn't redirect his behavior. She doesn't oppose his worldview. She doesn't force him to make difficult choices because she's not actively tethering Arthur to humanity. She's symbolically representing the idea that he has a tether. And that distinction matters because the reveal only works structurally if the relationship was functioning as an actual dramatic anchor beforehand. If Sophie had been pushing Arthur towards a different life, or forcing him to choose between connection and violence, or representing a real worldview in opposition to his collapse, then losing her would mean something structurally. But Arthur is already psychologically detached before the reveal. He has no real relationships, no social interaction. He's already violent and unstable long before we discover that the relationship was imaginary. And this is where the draft comparison is interesting. In the earlier April draft, Sophie is more active. After Arthur's comedy performance, she actually talks with him about the subway murders. She says the rich guys probably deserved it, and she even calls the killer a hero. And that's a major difference. In that version, Sophie isn't just a fantasy girlfriend. She briefly functions as someone who reinforces Arthur's emerging worldview, and she validates the violence. She gives him ideological permission, and she connects the romantic thread to the class resentment thread. But that doesn't fix the structure. It just makes her more dramatically useful. So here is where we have to compare Sophie to Tyler Durden in Fight Club. In Fight Club, Tyler Durden's reveal reorganizes the entire movie because Tyler was structurally integrated into the narrative beforehand. They were inextricably intertwined. Tyler drives causality. He escalates the conflict constantly. He creates Project Mayhem. He radicalizes the narrator and he pushes the plot forward. So when the reveal happens, the protagonist's understanding changes, the stakes change, and the direction of the story changes immediately. Just think about Fight Club from the perspective of Marla Singer. When it's revealed that Tyler doesn't exist, all of a sudden you start thinking about all of this abuse that narrator has put Marla through by dismissing her after being sexual with her. It's tragic. It's horrific. It redefines narrator, not just the plot, but the character and everything that he did up to that moment. But in Joker, Sophie barely does anything before the reveal. On to the second thread. Thomas Wayne. This is the closest thing that Joker comes to having a functional dramatic spine, because it briefly gives Arthur a concrete pursuit. Once Arthur reads Penny's letter and believes Thomas Wayne may be his father, the movie finally develops forward momentum. Arthur goes to Wayne Manor. He confronts Alfred. He seeks out Wayne directly. He investigates Penny's history at Arkham. This is why reading the letter is probably the strongest candidate for a true midpoint, because it redirects the movie into a new line of action. But it still doesn't fully work as a midpoint. Why? Because a true midpoint should explode or transform the protagonist's Act 2 mission. It should force a new strategy because the first strategy has failed or evolved. That is not what happens here. Arthur does not arrive at the Wayne pursuit because his first mission collapses. The plot just hands him a new piece of information. He reads the letter, and suddenly the movie becomes about Wayne. That's a direction, but it's not the payoff to a sustained dramatic engine. And once the Wayne thread begins, it immediately collapses. Wayne rejects him. Arkham reveals Penny's delusions and abuse. Arthur learns the truth, and then he kills his mother. Instead of building sustained dramatic escalation, the thread just converts into backstory exposition. The April draft and the December shooting draft both use the revelation that Arthur may be Wayne's son as the midpoint. The specific language changes slightly, but the function is the same. Arthur suddenly believes his identity connects to Thomas Wayne. The later draft streamlines the material. It moves more efficiently from the letter to Wayne Manor, to Alfred, to Wayne, to Arkham. It's cleaner. But cleaner doesn't mean better. The rewrite improves momentum, but the Wayne thread is still externally introduced and it still burns out quickly. It also exposes one of Joker's biggest causal logical problems. Let's just walk through it. Arthur goes to Wayne Manor and he interacts with Bruce by literally putting his fingers inside this child's mouth. And then Alfred comes over and Arthur physically assaults him. And Alfred knows who Arthur is. In both the script logic and the world logic, this should have created massive consequences. Alfred should have called the police. There should have been security on the premises. Thomas Wayne is like running for mayor. He's one of the most powerful people in Gotham City. And Arthur is already loosely connected to this clown-related murder investigation. They should be coming after Arthur, but they don't. Why? Because the story needed to have Arthur interact with the Wayne world, but it had no interest in the fallout. The bathroom confrontation with Wayne works the same way. Wayne initially treats Arthur like a stranger, but then all of a sudden he delivers the exact type of exposition that the scene requires. Penny was delusional. Arthur was adopted. The fantasy is false. In the April draft, Wayne explicitly says that Arthur was adopted and that he never slept with his mother. So the scene is emotionally useful, but mechanically it's convenient, and it doesn't really make any sense logically whatsoever. Let's just move on to thread number 3, medication and social systems. Early in the movie, the writers want Gotham itself to feel partially responsible for creating Joker. Arthur loses therapy. He loses medication. The funding disappears. The system abandons him. The intended thematic argument is straightforward. Society creates monsters through neglect. Okay. That's what I'm talking about, where, you know, you have themes and statements and things floating around, but you don't settle on a single yes or no thematic question that everybody can answer. Because society creating monsters, sure, that's a statement, it's a theme, but where does it get you? As a writer, where does it get you? And how does it connect everybody? It doesn't. This thread exists in both drafts. The social worker tells Arthur that the city's cutting funding. Arthur's immediate concern is how he'll get his medication. So that should be a major structural problem. But it never becomes an active dramatic engine because Arthur does not meaningfully engage with it whatsoever. He doesn't try to regain treatment. He doesn't search for alternatives. He doesn't pursue stability. He doesn't make choices around staying medicated or surviving without medication. The medication cuts create emotional pressure, but they don't generate any dramatic pursuit. And later, the screenplay weakens its own institutional critique because the Arkham revelations imply that Arthur's damage long predates the funding cuts. So now the movie is juggling social neglect, mental illness, childhood abuse, poverty, humiliation, emotional isolation, all without organizing them into a clear hierarchy. And yes, you can have a movie where all of these things exist and they can all be true, but they have to connect to each other. And Joker doesn't connect them, Joker stacks them. The fourth thread is the clown movement. After the subway killings, Gotham transforms Arthur's violence into this political symbol. Clown masks spread, public unrest escalates, city projects meaning onto the murders. It's eat the rich, right? Eat the rich. That's what this part of the movie's about. And the writers want Arthur to become mythic by accident. That idea is present across both drafts, but the later shooting script leans harder into it visually and politically. The problem is that Arthur contributes almost nothing to this movement's development. He doesn't organize it. He doesn't shape its ideology. He doesn't manipulate public anger. He barely engages with it at all. This is one of the main reasons the second act feels so unstable. The world is escalating around Arthur, but Arthur is not meaningfully driving any of that escalation. Which brings us to our fifth thread, Murray Franklin. Murray represents recognition. He represents validation, public visibility. He's a symbolic father figure that Arthur actually wants. He's a mirror to what Thomas Wayne ends up being, or at least in Arthur's mind, that's what he is. The screenplay believes that it's building towards Arthur finally being seen in the world, and emotionally, the climax works because the movie understands the symbolic power of putting Joker on that stage and in front of that audience. But the progression into that climax is extremely weak from a causality perspective. Arthur bombs at stand-up. The footage is somehow recorded. It somehow reaches Murray. Murray airs it, and Arthur gets invited onto the show. The issue isn't plausibility. The issue is agency. Arthur is not strategically pursuing Murray. He's not trying to get on television. He's not escalating towards public recognition through a plan. The opportunity arrives externally because the screenplay needs him to be on the stage for the climax to exist. This was an easy fix by just having the open mic night be directly connected to Murray, by showing Murray early on, roasting other comics or being an insult comic, or, promoting the open mic, something to give Arthur a reason. If mission one in the first half of Act 2 was, I'm going to get seen, I'm going to be a comedian, I'm going to get on Murray, and I'm going to show Sophie that I'm worth something, that I'm worth being taken serious, everything else kind of starts to fall into place, right? It starts to make sense causally as the dominoes start to fall, instead of just these random things sort of happening. And when we talk about Murray, we're really talking about the last stage in the Joker transformation imagery. In the earlier April draft, the subway aftermath is way more panic. It's got shame, instability. Arthur vomits. He deals with the gun, washes himself off, and the sequence plays out more like a psychological fallout. In the later shooting draft, the bathroom aftermath becomes this transformational ritual. Arthur enters the bathroom overwhelmed. He performs this slow physical awakening, foot out, arm rising, turning as if something inside him is awakening, and then the Buffalo Bill, Silence of the Lambs, full reveal in the mirror. This is who I am. The rewrite turns guilt and panic into mythic emergence, and the later draft sharpens the Act 2 turn through performance imagery. Arthur prepares his Joker look. He spins to the music, he applies makeup, he kills Randall, and he descends the stairs, and he moves towards Murray. The screenplay becomes much more confident about Joker as movement, performance, and iconography. So the movie has several moments that feel like midpoints, but none of them actually function as one, and that's the same problem that the film has with its lowest point. What's the lowest point of the movie? What brings us into Act 3? Is it Sophie? Is it Wayne? Is it Arkham? Is it Penny? Is it Randall? Each scene is emotionally heavy, but none clearly destroy a stable Act 2 mission because the movie never really established one. That's an architectural problem. So this is the point where we can't avoid the Taxi Driver comparison any longer. Taxi Driver also begins with alienation and disgust and loneliness and urban rot. Travis Bickle is already deteriorating. The city feeds his disdain for humanity. But the movie layers that emotional deterioration onto a clear causal chain. Betsy enters as a positive alternative worldview. She represents connection, normalcy, social interaction. Travis pursues her because some part of him still believes that he can enter ordinary human life, much like Arthur. But he pursues her using the exact same worldview and strategies and psychology that he has already built up in his head. He doesn't try to adapt himself to her world. He tries to bring her into his, which is why he takes her to the porn theater. To Travis, that choice makes complete sense because his understanding of intimacy is already poisoned by the environment that's consuming. When Betsy rejects him, he cannot recognize that he sabotaged the relationship. He cannot blame himself, so he externalizes the failure. He lashes out at Betsy. His resentment broadens towards society, and then he projects that onto the senator, and then towards sport and the prostitution ring surrounding Iris. Every emotional failure redirects his behavior. The failed relationship intensifies his alienation. The alienation mutates into violent purification fantasies. He buys guns. He trains. He prepares for assassination. When that strategy fails, he redirects again. He reframes himself as a savior and projects meaning onto rescuing Iris. The emotional work is layered on top of a causal spine. Worldview, strategy, failure, redirection, escalation. Joker has the emotional deterioration. It has the mood. It has the iconic images. It has the performance. But it rarely builds Arthur's transformation through the same kind of sustained protagonist-driven causality. That's why Joker feels powerful as mood and imagery while still feeling dramatically ungrounded underneath the surface. The final act depends on all of these threads converging. And this is where the movie becomes complicated, because as a standalone sequence, I think that the Murray climax works extremely well. But as the climax to the screenplay and to the film as a whole, it's underbuilt. And because those are different issues, I want to kind of keep them separate. So before Arthur gets to Murray, the movie has to move him from his apartment to the studio. Functionally, that's what has to happen. And this bridge includes the Randall murder, Gary's escape, the makeup transformation, the stair dance, the detective chase, and the subway riot. Moment to moment, this section of the film, the bridge between Act 2 and Act 3, has a lot of energy. But this stretch also exposes the film's dependence on staging and propulsion over clean structural architecture and causality. Let's start with Randall. Randall's an example of Joker using supporting characters functionally rather than dramatically. He's friendly to Arthur when Arthur needs a gun. He becomes self-protective when the movie needs Arthur fired. And then he disappears completely until the final act when they need someone from Arthur's old life to walk into the apartment and become his next victim, or I guess his first true victim as Joker before he gets to Murray. And look, that doesn't make the scene ineffective. The scene is tense because Randall underestimates Arthur. Gary is trapped in the room, and Arthur has already crossed into a new psychological state, a psychosis. But Randall's return doesn't redirect the story. Arthur's already preparing for Murray. He's already moving towards his final performance, and Randall's death only intensifies the transformation. It doesn't create it. He's going to kill Murray either way. Like, Randall being there and being his victim only is there to be a gut punch to the audience to kind of prepare them for what's ahead. The scene is pretty similar in both drafts. Randall comes by because the police are asking questions and he wants to make sure that their stories line up. Arthur kills him. Gary is spared. The later draft makes Arthur's condition more explicit by having him say that he stopped taking his medication and feels better now. that line ties the murder back to the medication thread, but only very loosely, because Arthur never pursued medication, treatment, or stability as a dramatic problem. So the line functions more as a thematic recall than structural payoff. The April draft is much stranger, is how I would put it. After killing Randall, Arthur takes his money, he takes the gun, and he writes a note saying that he'll be on Murray and to please watch. That all of that detail makes the Murray appearance feel slightly more intentional. Arthur's not just going to the show, he is conscious of being watched. The gun is necessary because in the April draft, he had hidden the gun. He had gotten rid of the gun in the bathroom after the subway murders. And so the plot needed him to have a weapon again, right? He still needed that gun. And so once again, Randall comes in to provide the gun. He's a tool. He's not a character, he's a tool. The December draft strips away some of the odd connective tissue and pushes the final act towards a cleaner kind of iconography, the makeup, the suit, the stairs, the dance, the chase, the studio. As visual storytelling alone, the stair dance is one of the strongest moments in the film. That's why it's the poster, right? Earlier, the stairs are represented as a burden. We've talked about this before. Arthur climbed them as a defeated man, and now he descends them as a performer. The same location has been transformed because Arthur has also been transformed, and that is powerful. That's why it works here. That's why it worked in Into the Spider-Verse. It makes you think of The Exorcist because of staircases, but in that movie, the staircase in Georgetown is shown to be kind of this like benign thing that has no significance really until the ending of the movie when Father Karras tumbles down to kill himself to rid Reagan of the demon. So this push pull of imagery is not new to Joker, but they pull it off very well in the movie. It's powerful, but it's symbolic storytelling. It's not dramatic strategy. The movie's not showing us a plan unfolding through action. It's just showing us a body becoming an icon. It's showing Joker fully, transformed. Even though my argument would be that when he does his Buffalo Bill thing in the bathroom at the beginning, after in the act one turn after subway killings, he's already fully formed. So everything between then and now is just kind of, spinning our wheels because he already knows who he is. He's Joker at that point, right? That's the whole reason for that. Focusing on the April draft again, the makeup sequence is definitely more private, and I'd argue slightly more grotesque. Benny and the Jets is playing while Arthur is applying his makeup and dancing and gyrating and thrusting his hips. And he's copying the clown mask in the mirror. The script literally says that he is a copy of himself, which is good writing. I like that. Even though it violates show don't tell, I like that because it really does paint a picture. And that version is definitely uglier and more perverse than the shooting script, the December script that they ended up going with. And then the detectives interrupt the dance. This is where the film's problem with consequence becomes especially visible. The detectives have appeared before, but they haven't functioned as a sustained pressure. They only show up when the plot needs them to give Arthur an obstacle. They don't force Arthur to adapt across the second act. They don't tighten around him scene by scene. They mostly exist as atmosphere until the final act needs motion. Now they're active. They chase Arthur down the stairs, through the street, into the subway. The sequence works as propulsion, but it also exposes the problem that we talked about. Arthur's already gone to Wayne Manor. He's already interacted with Bruce. He's put his fingers in his mouth. He's assaulted Alfred. Alfred knows who Arthur is. It's no secret. Thomas Wayne is extremely powerful. He's running for mayor, and Arthur is already connected in a way to the clown-related murder investigation. In a more causally rigorous version of the story, that incident should dramatically change Arthur's ability to move through the city. Right? People should be looking for him. The detectives should have had a stronger reason to close in earlier, but if the movie had honored those consequences, then Arthur loses the freedom of movement that the screenplay needs him to have. He can't just drift from Wayne Manor to the hospital to Arkham, and then back to the hospital, and then back to his apartment, and then onto the stairs and over to Murray. So the Wayne thread is just dropped, not only because the father question's been answered, but because its logistical consequences would trap Arthur too early. The subway riot serves a similar function. Arthur escapes into a crowd of clown protesters, and visually, that's a really strong idea. I can see the image in the writer's mind. They're like, oh, this will be awesome, right? All these clowns, and then Arthur disappears in his clown makeup, putting a clown mask on, and now he's just part of the crowd. But again, to hammer this home, Arthur has nothing to do with the clown movement. He didn't organize it. He's not leading it. He's not directing it. He doesn't articulate it as his ideology. The movement grows around him, independent of him, and then becomes useful when the movie needs him to vanish into the crowd. And as myth, that works. As causality, not so much. But it does get us to Murray Franklin. And here's where I want to split the analysis in two. As a standalone sequence, and as a climax to the movie. As a standalone sequence, the Murray scene is excellent. The live television setting gives the scene immediate pressure. It reminds me of Network. Murray is calm, polished, professional, condescending. Arthur is volatile, theatrical, and increasingly dangerous. The studio audience adds another layer because they are trained by the format of the show to laugh. They expect discomfort to be entertainment, and they think that they know what kind of scene that they're watching. So we have audience expectation upon audience expectation. It's a great setup. And at first, Arthur is a weird guest, eccentric. I mean, that's the joke, right? I mean, I don't know if this was a meta commentary on when Joaquin Phoenix was on David Letterman. If you haven't seen it, check it out on YouTube. It's pretty interesting how disassociated he was from the actual interview. And that's what the scene initially made me think of. His timing's wrong. His energy's wrong. His responses don't fit the format. Murray tries to, and I'm talking about Joker now, not David Letterman, even though it applies to both. But in Joker, Murray tries to control the segment, but Arthur keeps pulling it away from him. The audience laughter becomes uncertain because the social contract of the talk show itself is collapsing in real time. That is excellent scene escalation. The confession to the subway killings changes the room completely. Suddenly, this is not a comedy segment or an interview. It's a hostage situation before anyone on stage has fully processed that shift. So the murder works because the film delays it just long enough to create this true sense of dread. A quick comparison to that would be the basement sequence in Inglourious Bastards. You know something terrible is going to happen, but Tarantino stretches that scene out for what feels like 45 minutes because he just wants to build that dread, just build it and build it and build it and build it, right? And it's a pressure cooker until there's nothing left in there and it has to explode. Climax of Joker has that same feeling. We know the scene is moving towards violence, but the exact form of that violence remains uncertain. Will Arthur kill himself? That's been hinted at numerous times in the film and in the script. In the April script, it's even more so, even more apparent that he's considering killing himself. Will he kill Murray? Will the show cut away? Will he freeze and not be able to do it? These are all the questions that, as an audience, having watched the movie, you're like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And so that's what creates that tension. It's good stuff. And if this were a one-act play about a dangerous man unraveling on live television, it would work. It has a clear location, a volatile central figure, a host trying to control tone, an audience inside the scene, and a public setting that turns every line into a threat. So no, I don't think the climax is bad. I think the climax is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, sequences in the movie. But as the third act of a screenplay, it's got to do more than just create suspense. It has to pay off Arthur's relationship to performance, fame, humiliation, father figures, comedy, class resentment, social neglect, violence, and the public construction of Joker, because those are all the things that the writers have been throwing at us, right? They didn't have to. They could have simplified it. They could have condensed it. They could have, but they didn't. They gave us all of these things, and now we have to deal with them in the third act, or else it'll feel incomplete. And this is just simply too much for how little Murray has been developed. Murray should be Arthur's final ideological opponent. He should embody the worldview that Arthur is rejecting. He should be the final human expression of whatever the movie has been building against. Media cruelty, public humiliation, false empathy, comedy is domination, the powerful turning suffering into entertainment, the father figure who offers recognition only as ridicule. All of that is available, but the movie mostly just uses Murray as a fantasy object who becomes a plot device. For most of the film, Murray is just the man Arthur imagines will validate him. And when I say for most of the film, it's really just once, right? Just that one fantasy sequence in the beginning. And then we just assume that that's kind of like that carries through the whole film. But it's not something that we come back to. It's just that one fantasy segment. Arthur fantasizes about Murray embracing him and praising him and recognizing his pain. Later, Murray becomes the man who humiliates him publicly. And that contrast is emotionally clear, but it's not developed enough to turn Murray into a true final opponent. So again, we look at the two different drafts to see what changed. In the April draft, Murray is given a little bit more of a comic worldview in the dressing room. He sees Arthur's clown makeup and frames it as a timely, edgy, and dangerous kind of gag, suggesting that the danger itself can be part of the joke. That's not a complete ideology, but it does point towards Murray's worldview, because Murray sees social chaos and personal instability as potential material. Everything is fair game. The December shooting script makes Murray more bluntly cynical. Jean warns him that Arthur may be too risky, and Murray essentially says that the segment works, so they're going to go with it. This is cleaner and closer to the finished film, but it also flattens what little philosophy Murray had in the earlier version. So the rewrite, again, sharpens Murray as an exploiter, but it doesn't deepen him as an antagonist. To me, that's a huge wasted opportunity. If Murray had been established earlier, someone who routinely humiliates vulnerable people for laughs, or if Arthur's open mic night had been directly connected to Murray's show, or if Arthur had been actively shaping his comedy around Murray's approval, then the climax could become a true collision of worldviews. Arthur's need to be seen would collide with Murray's belief that people like Arthur exist only to be laughed at. But because the movie does not build Murray that way, he enters the climax with surprisingly little to say. He mostly reacts or scolds Arthur, expresses moral outrage. He becomes the voice of basic decency. I mean, you've got Robert De Niro here, and pretty much the only thing you have him say is, you know, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? How could you do those things? What's wrong with you? What's the matter with you? De Niro doing a De Niro impression. That's what it turns into. And that's not enough. That's not enough because basic decency has not been established as Murray's governing worldview at all. Arthur's monologue has the same problem. It sounds like thematic payoff because it touches everything the movie has been circling: society, neglect, humiliation, comedy, cruelty, class, recognition, what people deserve. But the speech doesn't resolve a dramatic argument because the movie never really committed to one. And it's simply not enough to say, I don't believe in anything, or I just want to be seen. Like, it acknowledging how messy the plot is doesn't excuse how messy the plot is. I'm sorry, it just doesn't. So once more, we must make comparisons to the two films that Joker is riffing off of, Taxi Driver and King of Comedy. I will focus on the ending of Taxi Driver because Taxi Driver's climax is equally horrifying, if not more so. But it's also structurally inevitable. Travis's final violence is the endpoint of a chain that the movie has been building. Worldview, failed strategy, redirected blame, escalation, explosion. Joker reaches a superficially similar endpoint. Alienated man, decaying city, public violence, ambiguous mythmaking. But the path is much looser. Arthur's final act is not the result of a sustained strategy failing and transforming. It's the convergence of several symbolic elements. The gun, the makeup, the television camera, the crowd, the riot, the false father figure, the desire to be seen. It's that inevitability that separates Taxi Driver from Joker. Travis Bickle had to commit the acts of violence that he committed because his body wouldn't let him do anything else, and all of his other attempts at dealing with his own self-loathing failed. I don't get that at all in Joker. So let's move to King of Comedy, because that comparison is even more direct. Why? Because that film is also about a delusional man who wants to be seen on television. Rupert Pupkin, played by Robert De Niro. He wants access to Jerry Langford, played by Jerry Lewis, And he wants this access from the very beginning. The entire movie is structured around that pursuit. He tries polite access, then he tries social proximity, then he tries fantasy and persistence and intrusion, and then finally kidnapping. Every failure pushes Pupkin towards a more extreme strategy, which is why Rupert's television appearance works as a climax. It's not handed to him by coincidence the way that the Murray appearance is handed to Arthur by coincidence. He forces it into existence. He commits a crime to get the thing he's wanted from the very beginning. In Joker, Arthur hints at wanting recognition, but he's not really pursuing Murray as a concrete goal across the film. He watches Murray. He fantasizes about Murray. Murray means something to him emotionally. There's a connection between watching Murray and being with his mother. But the opportunity to appear on the show is delivered completely from the outside. Tape is recorded, reaches Murray, Murray airs it, and then the show invites Arthur on. In The King of Comedy, the protagonist drags the plot towards the television appearance. In Joker, the plot delivers the television appearance to the protagonist. And that difference changes how the climax feels. And I would also urge anybody interested in this kind of material to watch Network, because that also shows you how the same kind of setup, the same kind of climax can work extremely well when done right. After Murray's murder, Joker gives fully over to the myth. The Waynes are killed. Arthur's rescued from the police car. The crowd gathers around him. He rises and paints the blood smile onto his face. As an image, again, very strong. This is the birth of the Joker that we know, the Joker as public icon. But Arthur didn't lead the movement. He didn't organize the riot. He didn't direct the killing of the Waynes. He didn't intentionally create the political meaning that Gotham assigned to him. The world turned him into a myth because the movie needed the myth. And for many viewers, that's enough. The ending gives them the icon that they came to see. And I understand why it works. The Murray scene is tense, the riot is striking, the blood smile is memorable, and the performance is powerful. And so when you leave the theater, the things that stick with you are the dancing in the stairs, the violence on stage, the brutal killing of Randall, the Sophie reveal. I mean, the parts of the movie that work stick with you, and you kind of forgive it for all of its other issues. But the second you start deconstructing it, or thinking about it logically, or thinking about it from the standpoint of screenplay architecture, the whole thing kind of collapses and falls apart. And that's exactly why Joker remains a fascinating screenplay to study. Because the movie made a shit ton of money. Made a ton of money. It was nominated for a ton of awards. So maybe I'm wrong about all of this, but I don't think I am. I think that the movie took on a life of its own, and you can never predict that, right? You can never predict that. That's why there's no such thing as a formula that works, because if the formula always worked, it would always work. And if veering away from the formula always failed, then it would always fail, and then Joker would have failed. But just to sum up my feelings on Joker, this is a very messy script that could have been very satisfying. In my next deep dive breakdown, I'll explain what I mean by going through Will Tracy's screenplay for Begonia, which I think is a fantastically tight and well-written script that adheres to the formula and elevates it, which is why it deserved to be nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay. So until next page, I'm Matt Weiner, and this is Fade In, a channel dedicated to the art of screenwriting.